acidity, and pH in fermenting wine, mead, cider, and beer.
Let's talk about it today on the Fermentation.
I'm Brian.
I'm Derica.
And we have notes on two different things that we've done in the past, but we're doing it new because we've learned some stuff since then, and we want to make it more appropriate for you.
That's right. pH is actually really important in considering when you're homebrewing, but maybe not the way you think it might be.
Well, see, here's the thing, too. We've learned it's super important, and it's not important at all.
It's one of those things. There's no such thing as an absolute. We are not the Sith. We don't deal in absolutes.
That's right.
No. There's always and never all the time, and sometimes maybe throws in there. Just cause.
Actually, I'm really curious. Just let me know in the comments below. Light side or dark side? Okay, so back to pH.
All right. So pH affects different things. It's going to affect the ability of your yeast to do its job. And that is where we start because that is the beginning of the fermentation process, is it not?
Right. And that's one thing that's very important. At the beginning of the fermentation process, you want one thing. At the end, you want another. And a lot of people seem to get the wires crossed there and get that confused.
I agree. And I'm really glad that you brought this up at the front because hopefully you're still here with us and you're listening and you're paying attention.
If they're not still here, we've done something seriously wrong.
Because we have seen this in the comments time and time again, and we feel not confused by our viewers, but confused by how we did our job.
How did we go wrong?
Wrong. Because we're educators, we're teachers, we're sharers first and foremost. We're brewers because that's our venue, but we're really trying to bring information and share information and experience so that everybody can have a great time making homebrew.
I have an irreconcilable need to speak all
He does.
the time.
He does.
This is why we have, 6 or 8 YouTube channels now?
We have so many, and every day, and I'm not joking, he's like, oh, we could do this thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, we could, but
Yeah.
I digress. So what we want our pH range to be at the very beginning is to make fermentation possible.
Right.
But that is a different number than when it is at the end of your brew.
But there's more to it than that even.
But this is something, we're getting back to the confusion.
Okay, go. Yep.
So we've seen lots of people comment and say, at the end of my brew, I adjusted my pH to get back in that normal range. Please.
That's a bad idea.
Don't do that.
If you take nothing else from this video, it's at the end of fermentation, do not raise your pH.
No. At the end of fermentation, ideal for preservation and clarity of flavor is to have it low, under 3 on the pH, because the lower the number of the pH, the more acidic your brew is, and the more likely it'll remain stable and clean and wonderful and preserved.
We do sometimes add acidity to a brew at the end.
Right.
And we usually do it for flavor reasons, not for pH reasons. I don't even check the pH at the end.
Nope.
Because we know it's going to fall to that natural range.
And maybe we should.
We said under 3, but really it's like anything under 3.5 to 3.3.
Well, maybe we should start incorporating a final pH.
We can. We've done it a couple times. We could.
To help people out to know this is normal, this is okay.
That would be a great demonstration of this is okay.
Don't adjust at this point. And if you do adjust, you want to make it more acidic, not more basic.
Yep.
So you want the pH number to be lower, not higher.
Right.
But you don't need to force it in one direction if you're within the range of stability.
Now, every yeast is a little bit different for their preferred pH range. What we found is that 4 and above is totally fine for the vast majority of yeast. Now, I have had people argue with me.
For the beginning of fermentation.
Yes, this is at the start. I have had people argue with me that it needs to be 2.8 or 3 or 3.2. I have a feeling they're confusing that with the final pH of wines and things like that for preservation, which is exactly what we were just talking about. For fermentation to start, you don't want it that low because yeast are going to die. That much acidity will actually kill them.
So I think perhaps in our passion, our joy, our willingness to dispense
exuberance
information, we may have slightly jumped the gun on where we need to start with this conversation.
In this podcast? Absolutely.
In this podcast.
We jumped to the 25-minute mark yet we're only at the 5-minute mark.
Bless me. Oh my goodness. I hope
You're not supposed to bless yourself. You're supposed to let someone else do it.
All right. So let's start at the beginning because that's the best place to start, isn't it? So at the beginning of fermentation is when you want your yeast colony to build, to grow, to multiply and be fruitful. So that way they can get to work to creating and transforming the fermentable sugars into alcohol and CO2.
Can we back up one step and talk about pH for just a second? pH is a number based off of alkalinity or acidity of a liquid, usually. So in this case, we're working with liquid. Water is considered neutral, which is about 7 pH. Now, your tap water may be slightly acidic or slightly basic, depending on what extra additives they have in your water. Pure distilled water should be right around 7, with very, very, very small differences. So anything lower than 7, a lower pH, is more acidic. Anything higher than 7, which is a higher number, is more basic or more alkaline. So we're talking numbers in the 4 to 5 range and 2 to 3 range, versus if you're at like 8, that's probably not a great thing for anything. I'll just be honest, because I don't know how you could even get a brew to 8.
Right.
Unless you added a ton of stuff that buffers, like a sodium bicarbonate or something like that.
And why would you do that?
Yeah, please don't do that. Please don't do that, because you're setting yourself up for a different problem that we'll get to in a few minutes.
I feel like we might be complicating the problem.
I think we are. That's why I wanted to start with, what does pH mean at all?
Sure. So in general...
Here's the problem. We have 2 sets of notes from 2 different videos, and we're trying to combine it into one, just to not waste time.
Okay, so now that Brian has talked about pH and what the range of pH and that 7 is neutral, but we're not even really considering that in this particular process because we're talking about yeast and fermentation, we want to be well below that. So we want to be more acidic. And there's varying degrees of acidity, and where it's good for the yeast to be fruitful and multiply, where they are at when they're actually fermenting, and then where it's at when the fermentation is done. So yeast cells can tolerate a pH of roughly 4 to 8.5, but there's other things that can tolerate those higher ranges too, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
But yeast also work best between 4 and 6 pH.
And that is a much more comfortable range, particularly because we know that the fermentation process is an acidifying process. So as those yeasts start to create alcohol, that pH number is going to go down.
Yep, automatically, just on its own. By a couple of different processes. One is the creation of carbonic acid, which is from the CO2, just basically dissolving into the liquid, and that's produced by the yeast themselves. So it's an automatically acidifying process right off the bat. Now, one reason why you don't want your pH to be too high, and we say this, and I don't want to scare anybody. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, and I don't want to make it like you need to be concerned and terrified. It's not that at all. But botulism is a very dangerous thing if it gets into your body and it starts to be able to reproduce and come alive. They're usually in spores, and those spores are dormant. Now, honey is one of the things that can actually carry botulism spores.
Does that mean that there's botulism in all honey? No.
It means there's a possibility that it could exist. Kind of like we live in Florida. There's a possibility there's a gator in every body of water, but it doesn't mean there is a gator in every body of water. It just means that every body of water can support a gator. Same idea. That was that just came to me too. I just have to say.
Florida.
But anyway, so that's the idea. Most honeys probably don't have botulism spores in them. So botulism cannot grow or flourish in 4.6 pH or below. So it doesn't like acidic environments, but it likes that 4.6 and above range. So you ideally want to keep below 4.6, but there's a caveat to that. As we said, fermentation is an acidifying process. So if you're close to that range, like at 5 or whatever, you're probably just fine, even if there's botulism spores in your honey, which you can't know until you find out that you have botulism.
I always try to attribute different scenarios with something I'm more familiar with. And I have been an aquarist since I was a little girl.
Is that what they call it? Aquarists?
Aquariums of fish and plants in my bedroom or whatever. And I adore my fish and I'm super happy about it. And so I know that the different things going on in the water are really going to either enhance the life of my plants and fish or drastically reduce the life of my plants and fish.
Sure.
And the fermentation process is a natural process. You're dealing with live entities, aka yeasts. And there's a multitude of other live entities that could possibly be in that brew that you either want or you don't want.
Most of the time you don't.
The chemistry of your brew, pH in this particular example, is important to know what you're going to allow to thrive in that environment and what you're going to push out, kill, or nullify in that environment.
That is a great way to look at that.
So the first one, the one that we're prioritizing above all else is yeast. So we want to make sure that our environment, it makes our yeast happy and healthy and not stressed.
So we're talking between 4 and 6 pH.
So we're talking about 4 and 6. And then we're thinking about all the bad guys, botulism being numero uno bad guy.
And there's multiple other biologicals that can exist.
That need similar environments to the yeast because they're living things.
Like 5 and up.
But they're more delicate than the yeast. So if we can ride that line where we're low enough in the pH, we're more acidic enough to inhibit the growth of the bad things, but still allow the yeast to be fruitful and multiply, then that's the golden spot. And that's why we aim for 4.
That was a very, very good explanation of that.
Thank you.
I know I've turned this into a kind of a chaos thing, and you just made it very clear. That was good.
I'm trying to reel us back in.
The problem is I'm a stream of consciousness kind of guy.
He is.
And I come up with ideas, and sometimes they just come right out of my mouth before I can really think about it.
Right. But everything we've said, regardless of how chaotic it might have been, is productive to this conversation overall of pH and the pH that you should be striving for in your homebrew. So we have some bullet points here of what ranges we're looking for.
But we're still talking about starting fermentation.
Right.
Okay? We haven't gotten to end. We're still at beginning.
So back to the yeasts, because they're our primary environmental critter that we're trying to host a pleasurable environment for. Multiplying, which is the very beginning of fermentation, they like a pH right about 5 or maybe even a little bit higher. But
they do actually.
We also want to remember that botulism guy, that bad guy, likes a 4.6. So if we can have it lower than a 4.6, then that's going to be really perfect because we're still going to have a more favorable environment for the yeast, but not favorable enough for botulism to do its thing.
Right. Just putting this in another perspective. If between 4 and 6 is perfect for yeast, but we know that 4.6 and above is also favorable for botulism and other types of things, then that gives us 4 to 4.6 as our range.
So
keep in mind, a little wiggle room, because it does acidify as it ferments.
Now, once our yeast have been fruitful and multiplied and it's time to get to work and make fermentation happen, they want a pH lower than 5, which is perfect again because we want to be lower than 4.6 for our botulism guys. Then, at the very end, they're going to stop growth at pH below 2.8. So we actually haven't tested the pH range of the fermentation process itself in particular brews to know what our starting pH is versus what our lower pH is.
We have done once or twice.
But I don't think it has been as extreme to 4.6 to 2.8.
No, it was more like maybe 4.5 to 3 or 3.2.
Right. So utilizing pH as an ending note for stopping fermentation isn't something we really have developed or experienced.
Yeah.
Mostly because we don't really like our brews to be overly acidic on the flavor profile.
Right.
So we like them to be acidic enough for preservation, but not overly acidic to stop fermentation.
So you're suggesting that there's a possibility of stopping fermentation by adding extra acid.
There is suggestion that's a possibility, which we haven't tested.
I would say that is a possibility, except for our grape juice wine test. That grape juice is like 3.0 or 3.2, and it just fermented straight through, and it didn't seem to stop. So
It did.
So I'm not sure
and
that you
side
can
note,
stop fermentation with pH.
Side note about that particular grape juice, we had extra grape juice left over, and so I was drinking that by itself, not fermented, just straight up grape juice. It was so acidic that it actually upset my stomach just from the acidity level on it. And the yeast didn't care. They just
yeast
fermented it like it was no problem.
Yep. If you didn't see that test, we'll link it in the description below.
And so this is a good point for us at this time to talk about different ingredients and different pH levels. There is no universal, this is the number, this is the golden mean across the board. There's multiple variables depending on your ingredients, depending on your yeast type, depending on your temperature, depending on your ABV. All of those things are going to come into play. So there's not one specific, this is going to work all the time and everything.
That's fair. I think that's a general rule of life, though.
It is.
No one thing works all the time.
But we've been asked that point blank. What is the number?
Yeah.
What is the magic number? There is no magic number. I'm sorry.
Well, when it comes to pH, if you're between 4 and 4.5 to start, you're probably 99.9% of the time in a good range.
Right. And that's what I was trying to say in a more elaborate fashion, is that there's no number.
That's why I'm here, to simplify things and streamline it.
Is a range.
And cause chaos, which I haven't really. Oh, I started out chaotic. We got better. I got better.
So there's more science in this process beyond just what grows in this this pH range and what doesn't grow in this pH range. Is that the bonds with the yeast and how they're fermenting during this process actually changes dependent on the pH level. So the pH can actually affect the bonds of the different proteins and molecules within your beverage.
Right.
This is, I'm going to say slightly, and that's a joke, but this is way beyond the scope of this.
It's above our pay grade.
Particular talk, but it is something I think that is important to take into consideration.
Sure.
That science is occurring in that jar.
Right.
Science that you could probably spend a lifetime plus 2 before you even get half of what is actually occurring in there.
I think a big thing that a lot of people don't take into account when they're fermenting or brewing is that you're dealing with live organisms. So there is no absolutes anymore. There's always in this situation, in this environment, under these conditions, using this recipe, everything is going to have a little bit of sway. And even a few degrees of temperature change can make a huge difference, because those yeast might be like, okay, this is a little too acidic for me, but the temperature's nice, so I can put up with it. And that kind of thing is happening all the time. There's always a give and take about all those environmental conditions. So that's something to be important. But one thing I want to talk about is, we didn't even get to it, is what if your pH is too low or too high? How do you adjust it? What do you do? How do you fix it?
And that's where buffers come in.
Buffers and acids, actually.
Sure.
Let's talk about some buffers and acids for a second, shall we?
All right, let's say your pH is above that 4.6 range to protect you from the dreaded botulism. Let's say you're at a 6.
That doesn't protect you from it. That puts you in danger of it.
So what do I do, Brian?
You want to add some acid. And I don't mean the stuff that makes you think all loopy. I mean like actual acids. Citric acid, malic acid, and what's the other one that I can never...
Tartaric.
Tartaric acid. Cream of tartar. That's what I have to think of.
Yeah.
The tartars.
There's also acid blends that have a variety of both. Basically, you want to add something acidic. And if you don't have the additives...
Each acid does something different, though, too.
You can add lemon juice or lime juice.
Lemon juice is going to be...
juice.
I mean, they're going to be mostly citric acid, as you could tell.
Right.
Apples actually contain a lot of malic acid. It's kind of a little more harsh of an acid. Tartaric acid, I forget the actual...
Is that in pineapple? What's
No, I don't remember. Citric acid adds almost a little bit of a fruity vibe. Tartaric is the one that I can never remember what tartaric does. I generally do not add tartaric acid on its own, though. We usually use acid blend or citric acid.
Yep.
almost exclusively those two. If we're working with something that has citrus or a fruity flavor, citric acid can be a really nice addition. But honestly, an acid blend usually works just as well in 90% of cases.
Sure.
So
if you're not looking to adjust the flavor, you're just looking to adjust the pH, then the acid blend is perfect.
Exactly. Now, on the other hand, if you are at 2.0 pH and you're just getting ready to start fermentation, that is way too low. Now you need something that's called a buffer, or something that's more basic or more alkaline. And for those, we actually use potassium bicarbonate.
Yep.
Now, you can also use potassium carbonate. You can use calcium carbonate. You can even use sodium bicarbonate, which is also known as baking soda. However, there's a caveat. Baking soda, because it's sodium bicarbonate, can add a salty flavor if you start to use too much. Now, too much is also relative to your personal bias, the brew you're using, and how much you had to add.
There's also certain conditions where adding a salty note, even salt itself, to a brew can enhance the flavors and mitigate negative flavors. We can do that. If you're interested, let us know in the comments below on another podcast.
So welcome to Homebrew, where everything is an if, then, and but situation.
Or maybe.
Or a maybe. Or a possibly heck no. Because this is the funny part about it. Everything comes down to the more you've done it, the more you kind of have a feel. And over time, that becomes an innate ability to say, oh, hell no, I'm not doing that. Or, yeah, I think this is a good idea. And you'll see it in our channel when we'll suggest things. Like I might just throw something out there, and every once in a while, Derica will be like, no. And then I talk her into it sometimes. And other times, she'll throw something out that I go, no. And then I go, wait a minute. Let me think about that for a minute. And it makes sense.
Potential here.
And that's kind of the cool thing about having two brains working on this. But it's also the cool thing about Homebrew is that there's such a wide range of possibilities that in most cases, what you do really depends more on what you want it to end up as than what you actually thought it should be. And what I mean by that is if you want something that actually has a nice, sharp, intense flavor at the end, then you want to maybe acidify at the end if you didn't at the beginning, if you didn't need to. Or if you want something to be a little smoother and light, maybe you don't want to acidify. But it's at the end, it's kind of a flavor thing more so than anything super important. And you want to just keep that pH below like 3.5 for preservation, and you should be good. But in the beginning, you really want to keep it above 4 because the yeast don't like it. And at that point, you're trying to please the yeast. At the end, you're pleasing your palate.
Yep.
I hope that makes it make sense. We have a note right here that says a better option for both is to ferment a must at a proper pH and then add any highly acidic elements after ferment is complete. That's pretty much what I just said.
Yeah. So I'm going to read some science because
we have notes here.
It's annoying to try to remember all this stuff, I'll be honest with you. But there's a lot of cool science going on. And if I was more into the science stuff, which I actually really am, but Brian gets annoyed with me because he's like, why are you being such a geek? I would go into depth about these things, but I feel like they're important enough to discuss even briefly here. So I'm going to
never called you a geek.
Give it a go.
Nerd, maybe, but not geek.
So as I mentioned before, the pH also affects the shape and function. Whoa.
Careful, we're going to get demonetized here. Is that even a word?
As I mentioned before, pH also affects the shape and function of proteins. Enzymes, for example, are proteins that can speed up chemical reactions. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, can be either acidic or basic, despite what their name suggests. So that's where super science comes into play, where you need to know all these different elements to know how adjusting your pH is going to affect those particular proteins.
I'd like to have a talk with whoever named amino acids if they can be basic too.
It's like, what?
That's just stupid.
And that's why I put that note in there that the name doesn't necessarily mean what it's saying. It's just...
This word does not mean what you think it means.
That's right. When the pH level increases, the bonds of the proteins are changed and make fermentation difficult. So sometimes a pH adjustment is going to change those molecular bonds and cause hindrance to the fermentation. Other times, they're going to change those bonds. It's going to make a more pleasant and more easy fermentation. And that is where your ingredients list and how they react with the different bonds is going to make all the variables come into play. So when we say there's not one answer, this is some of the science behind of why there isn't just one answer.
Like, for instance, just giving you a practical example, our juice wine example may be the exception to the rule. Other ferments may actually work badly in the situation that one was in, where that worked perfectly simply because of the different types of proteins and amino acids that are formed.
And I think this was illustrated quite succinctly for us when we did our test of the wine, where we had our really generic basic wine and then our elevated add more things wine. We didn't adjust the pH in the basic, and it still fermented like
the same,
nobody's business. So in wine and that particular protein configuration, the pH wasn't as big of a detractor for the fermentation process, whereas it might be accentuated in something less nutrient rich, such as a mead or a sugar wash.
In other words, there's a lot of variables. So if you meet 4 out of 5 variables, maybe pH isn't as important. But if 4 of those variables aren't met, maybe pH becomes more important.
All right. We have talked an awful lot about pH. We have crammed in as much as I think we could on this particular topic, the different stages of fermentation and when it's more important to be at one range versus another range. The only thing I think we haven't really struck home, we lightly talked about it, but I don't think we stressed it enough, is at the end of fermentation. Okay.
For that, stay below 3.5. Really simple.
Yes.
If your must completes fermentation, it's still at like a 4 pH, you definitely want to acidify that, or else it's not going to preserve as well. What I mean by that is shelf life. How long can that sit? Because as it's a little higher in that pH range, more biologicals and pathogens can actually try to take hold in there. Whereas below, say, 3.5, 99.9% of those just can't. They can't live. They can't survive.
And this is utilized a lot in the commercial realm, particularly with commercially made wines. Once the fermentation is completely complete, most commercial wineries will actually add an acidifier at the very end, because this is going to create a more stable environment for the aging of their wine.
And a hostile environment for the biologicals.
Right. So those proteins that I keep referring to that are breaking down and readjusting in the more acidic environment are going to be more stable. They're not going to allow those pathogens, as Brian mentioned, to come into play. They're just going to kill them outright, and they're going to keep their molecular arrangement more stable.
I think we've about covered it. If you have any questions about pH that we didn't possibly cover in this video, or you have a topic that you'd like to see us talk about on the Ferment Station, ask in the comments below. And as always, guys, thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.